Okay, good morning, everyone. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're closer to the bottom of page 1332. So I'm going to do a little summary here, as we usually do, but especially now. So just give me a minute. Okay, good morning, everyone. Something there. One second. Okay. So we're learning about the difference between Ohr and Avir. And that's in the context of the three different types of how gvuras, severities, judgments, darkness, is sweetened from the bitter or illuminated from the dark, which is the whole purpose of existence. Like the Rebbe Rashab said a while back when he started the whole topic. I'll give you the pages where he spoke about it very specifically. On page 1307. Just shut off these notes. I don't want to get rid of the sounds. I don't understand why it's making these sounds. And he spoke that the transformation of the darkness of existence is not just about illuminating and dissipating the darkness, it's also about transforming it, which is very much the central theme of this volume in Ayin Beis, volume 3, Ein Oid. In that verse, V'yadaita Hayom v'shavesa levavecha ki Hashem ki Havaya Elokim b'shamayim v'mal v'aretz mitachas. So up to that point, the last two words are Ein Oid, but before that, he discussed at length in volume 2, the second half of volume 2, that it's referring Havaya Elokim, that even in the tzimtzum of Elokim, we also recognize and we reveal the light. But it's not the transformation of Elokim. The tzimtzum itself, the concealment itself, or the way that he puts it, the kelim itself, or the Reshimu itself, is just now basically transparent and allowing the energy, the earth, to flow through it. But he wants a total transformation. That was the whole point, as he said explicitly on page 1310. I'm just using some random phrases through these pages, and that led us into a discussion of the three forms of sweetening the gvura. One is that you neutralize it or you nullify it with like sweetness, with chesed, with ohr. The second is you transform it with a very powerful ohr that comes from atik. That's so powerful where there's no such thing as darkness altogether. So when it enters, it b'mkayim ha'cheshech, but you can't say the darkness itself was transformed from within, it was transformed from without. And then finally, there's the third, and all that is, I'm talking now pages 1315. The second type is 1317. And then on 1325, he says, Omnam Yeshef and Gimel is the third way where the Ena Gvuras Nimtokan Ela B'Sharshan, that these Gvuras, this concealment, these severities, these judgments are only sweetened from their root, which means the power of their root, which is Nehela Ma'atzmi, in God's divine power to conceal. So why is that called from within? Because it's a koyach nelam, as he explained, he asked that question, explained that on page 1328 and 1329. So koyach nelam, that means it's concealed, it's fundamentally concealed, even though it's coming from the Shefer Gadol, the great Shefer that awakens and stimulates even the lost souls or those souls on Yom Kippur that on their own have no stimulation, no revelation, but Yom Kippur just has that effect on them. That effect is not coming in a revealed manner. It's coming from behind the scenes. It means because the concealment is very much rooted in that core place. And how does it express itself? That is coming from the distress of the animal soul. This is not coming from the revelation or even the distress of the divine soul. Because this is Dafka, the Baal Tshuva, the person who's been in such darkness, that itself, there's something there within. We spoke about the hypothermia, psychological or spiritual hypothermia, something within there that is ultimately a divine force, and that ultimately is a transformation from within. On page 1329, he began, the difference between Avir and Ohr, which we're in the middle of right now. So Avir and Ohr are two levels. Ohr is clearly light. Avir is what happened on day one in creation, before light was created. Avir is the level of cheshech al pnei tahem, darkness. It's a state of darkness, as he explained at length, which in Kabbalistic and Chassidic terms is the Reshimu. Not the Kav, not revelation of Ohr, which comes after the Reshimu, but the Reshimu, which is a concealed entity. In the Reshimu itself, like in Avir, there are two levels, Avir she'eina nitfas and Avir she'nitfas. There's an Avir that is completely removed and not graspable. That's the very etzem nekudas Reshimu, like the very letter, the very power to create gvul, which comes from Helam Ha'atzmi. But there's also, Avir is also the words Ohr Yud in a form of a Yud, like you said on page, the Yud HaKol Ba'avir, is the Ohr which is encompassed in Avir, but it's higher than the Ohr that comes out afterwards in the Kav, because it's like the light within the sun, or the level of Ayin, not Yesh. So even though it's the source, the Kav travels through the Reshimu and is affected by it, and ultimately the Ohr of the Kav, he said clearly on page 1332, I'm reading now, that V'ima Yeshu b'chinas moker l'gilui Ohr HaKav, because this is how the Reshimu is revealing God envisioning existence, which is this ultimately will become the Kav, is going to essentially express God's envisioning of the existence. It's going to be the 10 spheres, the revealed spheres, and the Reshimu includes that. So the Reshimu has the Ohr of the Kav in its core, coming from before the Tzimtzum, but the way it's in the Reshimu, it's a bechinas madregas nalas made, like I just said, like the light of the sun, Ayin. This is the level, yeah. Because this is the way that God already arose in his desire, what kind of existence he wants. Like the artist, he envisioned that particular art called the 10 hidden spheres. The 10 hidden spheres, after the Tzimtzum, is concealed within the Ohr of that, is concealed within the Reshimu, and then it comes out in the Kav. But the way it's in the Reshimu is in a far more concentrated and a far higher state than when it comes out in a revealed state. Now I'm going to sum up what we learned, the last thing we learned about the last second half of the chapter of the paragraph on page 1332. Just give me one moment. I wanted to see one more thing, one language that he said. It was interesting language. Now he did distinguish on 1330 the difference between the Yud, Chachma, as it's rooted in the source of the Kav, the head of the Kav, but that's still a Gilui, because it's in a state of revelation, like he made very clear. As a matter of fact, it's a undiluted revelation coming from Pnimius Atik, like. So it comes from like the Atik, which is the head of the Kav. So therefore, it has the power in the second type of sweetening to transform, like the Eitz HaChaim, but from without. It transforms the darkness into light. How much more so is the Ohr Reshimu, the Ohr that's encompassed in the Reshimu, the Yud within the Reshimu, which means the Yud within the Avir, which is not like the Yud outside, like an Ohr. There it's a Nakuda like Chachma. Here's the Yud within the Avir. He says, Bevadai, on page 1332, he says, Bevadai, those were his words, Bevadai the transformation of darkness to light. Okay. Now the next section, I'm going to elaborate a bit more because it was a little complicated, and I mean, at least to me. And I also want to refer to what he in the parentheses at the end of the paragraph, he referred to Shalhevis, to Eish Yud and Eish Hey. So I looked it up earlier in Ayin Beis. It'll help us understand this piece. So here said like this, V'yesh Leimer, he said in the second half of 1332, that this is like what it says elsewhere, and that elsewhere I found it in the Likutei Torah Chukas. He speaks about this, as well as in Mayim Rabim, Chukas Samach Vav Gimel, if you want to look it up. So Likutei Torah Chukas 66.3, or 66c, I should say. There are four columns in each page. And in Mayim Rabim, the Reb Marash has a famous Hemshech, a famous series of discourses called Mayim Rabim Tofresh Lamed Vov. The Reb Marash, a father of the Reb Rashab. So Tofresh Lamed Vov, chapter 63 and on, he also, is it chapter 63 or chapter 93? I think it's chapter 62 and on, where he also discusses this piece, in case you want to look it up. So basically, he's going to now talk about, we're talking two levels of the Yud. One is how it's in the Reshimu, and one is how it's outside of the Reshimu, in the Kav, which from there will come Chochmah. So we do know now that when it's hidden, it's the 10 hidden spheres. He just said that, which is the way God arises in God's desire. So it's called the Ohr that is Shaykh al Azulas, as he put it here. Ameir el Azulas. So we learned about three levels in Ohr. The Ohr that radiates to the other, that would be like preparing to communicate to another or envisioning existence. Rotzon shir asmei b'koyach, God allocates the resources, or it's the level of the source of Mamalakal Almin, as he said earlier on page 1330. Then there's a Ohr legalis la'atzmai, which is only to himself. And then there's Etzem Ohr that he said is not even revealed to himself. So he called that, earlier he called that the level that's even before Koydem Alei Sarat. Shalamayla Gam Koydem Alei Sarat. So Koydem Alei Sarat is the Ohr that is the root of transcendence, save of Kalam. The Ohr of Alei Sarat, which is when the desire, is the root of Mamal Kalam, the root of the Kav. And the Etzem Ohr is beyond both. And the Reshimu was very clear, has all three, but in a concealed, concentrated form. The Kav is going to be the revelation of the Ohr of Hagvul, which is essentially the Ohr of that Shaykh al Azulis. Now, so essentially you could say the Kav is going to manifest the revealed spheres, and that's originating from the hidden spheres, because that's the process that works. So he says, so elsewhere, and this elsewhere is most likely Mayim Rabim, because that's where he elaborates most about the hidden and the revealed. That it says, Rashveha Rishpei Eish Shalheves Yudke. That's a pasuk at the end of Shir Hashirim, that its flames are flames of fire from Shalheves, of the torch of Yudke. So what is that? He talked about that. That's Knesset Yisrael. Rishpei Eish, the Knesset Yisrael, the flame of the passion of the souls of Israel. And where does that Eish come from? Okay, so there he explains in Mayim Rabim that the Shalheves is referring to the flame that is connected to Kshura B'Gacheles in the example of a flame connected to a coal. So there's two dimensions to it. The flame as it's hidden inside the coal, and there's the flame as the flame that goes outside of the coal. And this is the hidden spheres, and the 10 hidden spheres and the 10 revealed spheres. Okay. And in Avodah, these two levels affect the Neshamas Yisrael. Remember, Neshamas have passion. They have a fiery passion. Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam. Where does that fiery passion comes from? Shalheves Yudke. But since the Shalheves, the flame is two dimensions, one that's hidden in the coal and one that's outside of the coal, that's sort of glowing and burning and like essentially rising outside of the coal. So the first one, the hidden one, that pales, that's the Avir of Reshimu. That's a more inner love and passion, fire, that is not sensed. It's not tangible. Built-in nigger's clause, the words he used. And the second dimension of the shalhevis that's revealed, flame that's outside of the coal, that causes a sense, a tangible love and passion. And that is the bittul alpitam v'das that comes from bina, whereas the higher one is coming from chachma, which is far more higher than rational. It's not something that you can touch, and that is mayim b'tam v'das hamusik. Okay. And he says, so this is the difference. So basically, the love that's revealed, that would be the kav, the ohr, or the chokhmah that is revealed, and that's causing a tangible and a passion that is sensed, that you can feel. And the higher one is like the Reshimu, though he doesn't say exactly those words, but clearly that's what he's referring to, and we'll probably see it clear in the next paragraph, is the way it's concealed. So there's definitely power there, but it's in a way that doesn't have a tangible element to it that's sensed in avodah. So he says that, and that higher level is ava b'tainugim. It's a very profound love of desires or pleasures, and that is what and that what do we draw down from there is the hidden spheres. And then he says, and we learned earlier that ava b'tainugim is what causes the transformation of the evil to the good from chapter 9 in Tanya, where he says that explicitly, that the tzaddikim gemurim, their deep, profound love transforms because it's so intense, it just transforms it, but again, from without, not from within. Now, I wanted to just touch upon the parentheses. He said to look earlier, we learned about Eish Yud and Eish Hey. So in volume 2, first I thought it was here in volume 3, I couldn't find it anywhere. In volume 2, on page 1192 and on, and as well as on page 840, but especially 1192, he talks about 2 levels of Eish. And clearly the Rebbe Rashab is referring to that. What does he say? I think it could be a little help here. Not a little, maybe more than a little help in understanding. So he says that Eish Yud and Eish Hey is the difference in a flame. There's the dark part of the flame that is consuming the wick. So it's darkened by the wick. That's the avodah with the nefesh habamis. So the flame itself is darkened, like choshech. Nehuda uchma it's called, the dark part of the flame. Then there's nehuda chivra, which is the white part of the flame, that's higher than the wick. And he says that's the ohr of the nefesh halikis. And he compares the two between the difference between the menorah, the flame that comes from the menorah, which was very quiet, and it just radiated. And the flames on the mizbeach, on the altar, especially the outer altar, well, not especially the outer altar, there it consumed an animal. So let's look at the difference when you see when a sacrifice was brought, it made a lot of noise because you're burning up the fat and the blood and the flesh of the animal. So whenever there's a flame burning, which is trying to consume something that needs to be sublimated, it's going to make noise. It's therefore a passion that has sound and noise. Like he said here, hargosha, you feel it. The divine soul's flame, which is the ohr, like the ohr of the menorah, is quiet. It's very silent. Think of like when you light a fireplace. In the beginning, when it's trying to catch, especially if the wood is wet or the wood is resistant, it takes time. It flickers, it crackles, and so on and so forth. At some point, once the flame is burning, it's very quiet. It's like a silent flame. So essentially, that's the difference between Eish Yud and Eish Hey. Eish Hey is the Eish of Malchus, he explains, how the neshama is elevating from the material world, from the animal soul, and therefore it's an Eish relates more to darkness, transforming darkness to light, but you're battling with the darkness. That's already like the first form of transforming darkness to light. The second is where the light is so powerful that automatically it elevates the darkness to light. So I'm assuming that's what he's referring to in this parentheses. You could also push it and say that Eish Yud is like the Ohr in Avir of the Reshimu, and Eish Hey is like the Ohr of Chochmah and the Kav. But I don't think that's the pshat. It's so short, you can't really see here. You can't really, Rebbe Rashab doesn't say enough information, but he does say, Ayin Mashin is bar le'el, so I'm just sharing with you what it says there. Okay, so that sums up where we're up to. And we still have to talk about the third level of transformation, and that we're going to learn soon is not Avir. Avir is still Ohr Yud, but it's the Ohr as it stands inside the Reshimu. And as I suggested, that's probably still part of transformation number 2, which means that the Ohr has the power because it's above Cheshach, above darkness, to transform. We're going to learn the next page that there's the third level, and that's the Reshimu itself. Remember, there's the Nekudas HaReshimu itself, which is just the pure power of Gvul that comes from Helam Ha'atzmi. But as we'll learn, there's levels in this. So let's bear with me. And now, if anybody wants to ask anything before I read on in the new paragraph on the bottom of page 1332, please, now is a good time. But as I said, the topic's not over yet, so your questions may be answered, but I'm happy to answer any question that you may have. Okay. Fine. So let's go. So the new paragraph is on the bottom of page 1332. You can follow these pages if you want to follow the text. You can follow it on ayinbeis.com. V'hine yedua, and now is reintroducing something we learned earlier as well. If you may remember, by mitzvahs, remember the point was that mitzvahs have the power to draw down atzmos. So he said, how does a mitzvah? Because a mitzvah is essentially Yud K Vav K, but the Mem Tzadik of the mitzvah is Esis Mischalfis. It's Esis that substitute Yud K. So Yud K comes in the form of Mem Tzadik. Okay, because in that Adbash, the way the Hebrew letters are structured, if you may recall, we learned about that. The Vav K is the second 2 letters of mitzvah, because that is revealed today, the lower levels. So when he spoke about that, he was speaking about the Rotzon Hashem, that mitzvah is God's desire. So though he's not going to talk here about mitzvahs per se, but you may remember some of this language because it was already discussed earlier. So so here's what he says. He says like this now. V'hine yedua, and now it's known. Sheyesh Shem Havaya Sheberotzon. That even not usually we think of Shem Havaya Yud K Vav K like we learned before. Chachma is Yud, Bina is Hey, Vav is Zah, the midas that like a Vav draw down the energy, and the last Hey is Malchus. That's in the spheres. But the fact is Havaya is also in Rotzon, also in Keser. There's Havaya also in the Rotzon of Hashem. Now you may recall on the previous page, when he spoke about Yud K, he said Yud also is the head of the Kav, and the Hey is Ak, Adam Kadman. Because there it already expands into, comes an entity. So that's general, but the fact is Yud K, Vav K is everywhere. We even learned that it's also there before the Tzimtzum. So he's just now going to bring that into the picture, and you'll see in a moment how that Yud comes into play. So he says, Shem Havaya Sheberotzon, the B'derech Klal B'china Shem Havaya de La'elo. This was also discussed earlier. In Havaya itself, there's Havaya de Latata and Havaya de La'elo. Havaya de Latata is usually the Havaya that relates more to existence, and Havaya de La'elo is a higher level. So he's saying that the Havaya in Rotzon is also, in other words, the God's desire also breaks down into 4 stages, Yud K, Vav K, but that's Havaya de La'ela in general. Why general? Because sometimes when you break it down further in Rotzon itself, sometimes it also discusses that there's a higher and a lower Havaya. But it's not so relevant to our discussion here. But the only thing I would say is the microcosm, macrocosm. Keep that always in mind. that everything that exists in Ishtalshlus also exists in higher levels in a more subtle form. So everything repeats itself. Just like you have the 10 revealed spheres, you have the 10 hidden spheres. Like we say Friday night, Kigavna le'elo latata, that which is below and that which is above is mirrored below, and that which is below mirrors what's up above. Okay, v'hainu. Now this means shagam b'bchinas harotzon shebein sof shelifnei hatzimtzum. That also in the Rotzon, remember just a little few words about that. God wanted us to understand as best as possible how, the process of creation. He could have created without Rotzon. He didn't need to have a desire. He could just say, I want to have existence. Poof, is existence. But he wanted it to make sense to us. So just like we don't build a house out of the blue. We first have a desire. The desire can be dormant and not even be aware of it. Then time with that desire awakens. Then it takes time until you actually develop the desire. And then you finally have the desire to actually do it. And there's stages. We learned this at length back in volume 2 and in Tzadik Daled, the Hemshech. So the way it works by us, remember, as the Alter Rebbe made such a point in Chassidus Chabad, mepsari echze leka. The only way to appreciate godliness, and God is completely beyond us, is because God implanted his own so-called personality and his method of creation and method of doing things in existence in examples that we can identify with so we can relate to how Hashem creates. And that's why we talk about Lifnei Tzimtzum, because Lifnei Tzimtzum is something that we have no access to. Remember, the whole purpose of a Tzimtzum is because Lifnei Tzimtzum, the energy is so intense, there would be no room for another consciousness. And yet we're being told what happens before the Tzimtzum. It's like we're being told what's going on in God's, I don't want to say mind, but in God's inner consciousness, because we want to understand as best as possible how God did it. And point number 2, to retrace the steps so we can connect to that there can be an achdus, a relationship between us and the divine. So that's why we talk about these high levels. So he says, now this is Rotzon in Ein Sof, Shagam b'Bchinas Rotzon shebein Sof, Yesh Gam Ken Shem Havaya, Yud, Hey, Chul. So also there's a Yud and a Hey and a Vav and a Hey. Excuse me. Here he's focusing on the Yud and the Hey primarily, especially the Yud. So now we went higher. Before we were talking about Yud of Chachma, which is rooted in the Yud of the head of the Kav. Now we're talking about the Yud in the Reshimu, which is a higher state because it's still concentrated in a concealed state, but there's a Yud there. The Yud of Avir, Ohr Yud. So he says, what is the Rotzon? And this again is ideas that were discussed earlier in Ayin Beis. If any of you have recently learned the beginning of Ayin Beis, you'll know right in the second page, the first page, but right the second page, he talks about Keser and says Keser is the first step because without God wanting something, there's no relationship. If you don't want something, if you don't want to come onto this share this morning, or you don't want to build a house, there's no house happening. It's not happening unless there's a Rotzon. So the first step, the first interface between an entity with something else is that I want it, that I desire it. So he says, what does Rotzon mean? Rotzon means that the Ein Sof Bal HaRotzon, the one who has a desire, remember, precedes the desire. You always precede your Rotzon. Your Rotzon doesn't come first and then you come second. First you exist and then you have a desire. And we're talking about higher level desires, we're not talking about superficial stuff. You want a home, you want a spouse, you want to build a family. I mean, I'm speaking on a very basic level. Or you want deeper things. You want a relationship with God. You want to fulfill your shlichus in this life. So he says that Rotzon is Masha Ein Sof Bal HaRotzon. The Ein Sof, meaning the Eibishter, as he's higher than Rotzon, Bal L'chlal Rotzon. He manifested now and came into the context, into the domain of desire. And again, he doesn't need to do that for himself. But this helps us understand how, like I spoke about, let's say the artist. The artist is not defined by being an artist. He's far beyond any type of art and so on. But he chose to be an artist and then to desire to create art. And then from the infinite possibilities of art he can create, he chose a specific piece of art. All this is reflected in the steps before the Tzimtzum. So the first step is Maza Ein Sof Bal Rotzon Bo L'Chol Rotzon. The Kedem Sha'ol B'Ritzeinei, and here we're not talking, which we discussed the other day, in time. This is conceptual. This is a conceptual hierarchy. We're not talking about the Kedem as in yesterday or the past. That prior to this state where he manifests in a desire, the Kedem Sha'ol B'Ritzeinei Kavyachol, that's the Kavyachol, so to speak. Lo Yaya Rotzon B'Gili Klal. This Rotzon that he has, whatever the Rotzon may be, here's the Rotzon for existence. It wasn't revealed at all, and here's the point. Gam Leila Atzmei, also to himself. And we already been asked, this question has been discussed. What does it mean? God doesn't know what he wants? That's not what it means. He means here Lamal Yusa, in a positive way. He's higher than Gilui. It's like when a person is born with a fundamental desire to have a home, even though it may take 20, 30 years till it's revealed, he's not even aware of it. That doesn't make it less. It just makes it so part of your etzem that it's beyond revelation. Obviously, above and by Hashem, it's even higher than that. So this is a state. It's not begilui. Gam leila atzmei, to himself as well, what he called before a level of etzem or. Sometimes in Chassidus, this is the level called Rotzon Muchlet Batzmuseh. Rotzon Muchlet Batzmuseh. That means there's a desire there, but it's not revealed, not even to himself. So now he's going to explain how the Yud comes into play. It's Kavyachol in a state of Tzimtzum. Now, Batzmuseh love the day Rotzon. So the way it stands, it's in a tzimtzum. Let's just see what he means. 1 second. So, but Pashtus, what he means here, most likely, is that in the state before he desires, where does the desire exist? It exists in a state of tzimtzum. It's completely, not, so to speak, completely concealed. Love of the day Rotzon. Or you can say it means that it needs a tzimtzum in order to come to a state of Rotzon. First, I was thinking that he means that it's in a state of concentration like tzimtzum. I think actually that might be what I just said is more correct. That in order for it to become a Rotzon, he now has to limit himself, so to speak, in some way. We're not talking about the tzimtzum arishin here. We're talking about in these highest levels, that in other words, God has to like say, okay, in my state of Ein Sof, that's completely beyond desire, I am so-called limiting and saying I'm going to have a desire. I think that's what he means. But it's a little not, the language is a bit unclear to me at least. Okay, yeah. It's a tzimtzum, so to speak, for God to come to a state of Rotzon, because he himself, the Baal HaRotzon, is higher than Rotzon. Rotzon itself is already a state of tzimtzum, basically. This is interesting because when the Rebbe spoke in Tov Shemem Hey, 1985, Yud Shvat time, he spoke about the tzimtzumim lifnei tzimtzum arishin. So I think this was referenced then. This, because you don't find in Chassidus very often, but here's definitely, in other words, even before the tzimtzum, you need God to go through stages of somewhat limiting or to some extent, all within the godliness, within the Ein Sof. Okay, let's continue. The Gamavur b'Malkam Acher. This is all going to explain the Yud of the Havaya b'Sheberotzon, the Yud in the Havaya Sheberotzon, which is the first tzimtzum. So Mavur b'Malkam Acher. It's also explained elsewhere. The Liyah she'atzmos eina muchrach b'Harotzon. So here's another point. That because Atmos is not compelled in this desire of his, like when we desire to eat or we desire anything, we're wired that way. We must have that desire for us to live. But God is not limited to any, is not defined or compelled to do anything. And this is what it means. It's his saying, it's his will, completely his free will. And it could have been, and it's possible that he shouldn't have had this desire. It's not like he must have this desire. Im kain, so this is what's explained in other Maimorim. Okay, yeah. So this is as if the desire was preceded by a non-state of desire. So Kod Mo'eheder, we discussed, you may recall, but I'll explain it again. It's an expression from the Chokrim, actually, but also Chassidus brings it. Kod Mo'eheder means a state of not, and Chiyuv is a state of yes. So whenever you say something has a beginning, another way of saying it is Kod Mo'eheder, that what preceded the state of being was a state of heder, of not being. So of course, existence definitely goes in that category. Bereshis bara l'kim z'shamayim v'sa'aretz, which is Kod Mo'eheder. But Chassidus uses this, that even in the higher levels before the Tzimtzum, even though you can't say that literally that something wasn't there before, but you could say it's like it wasn't there because it didn't have to be there. So Atzmus, God forbid, you can't say Kod Mo'eheder or Kamosha Kod Mo'eheder. But Ohr, just to use an example, Chassidus brings Ohr, even if it's Ohr Ein Sof that was always there technically, but it didn't have to be there because God chose it to be Ohr. So it's like Ka'ain Kamosha Kod Mo'eheder, sometimes Ka'ain Shekod Mo'eheder. So here he's saying, because the Rotzon did not have to be, it's like Kamosha Kod Mo'eheder. So in other words, there's a state, it's as if like something preceded there where there was no Rotzon. Okay, so he's adding to the first point. The first point was, without the hechlich, he just spoke that since Rotzon it was not there, so it's a tzimtzum to create a Rotzon. This Mamokim as explanation. And therefore, next page, 1333. So therefore it comes through a tzimtzum because Kod Mo'eheder, Kamosha Kod Mo'eheder. So therefore, since it didn't have to be, or so it's as if it was preceded by non-existence. So that's why it means as a tzimtzum, so to speak, in Asmusei, to get to the state of Rotzon. V'ze'in hayud, and that's the Yud in Rotzon. Till now, we're talking about the Yud in Chochmah and the Kav, and we also talked about the Yud in the Reshimu. We'll soon see what he's going to say about that. Now he's introducing there's a Yud in the Yud Kei Vav Kei in the Rotzon, because the first step of Rotzon is a Yud. It's a result of a tzimtzum. Shehu ha-tzimtzum shenif sherak nekuda the Rotzon hazeh shu b'chinas gilui la'atzmei. And that's this Reshimu. That's the tzimtzum, that there should only remain this nekuda of Rotzon, which is a revelation to himself. So the state before that is there was no revelation altogether. He wasn't aware. God was beyond definition. Here, at least, he's manifest in the form of a yud, a nekuda, that I want something. So now there's a gilui la'atzmei. It's not a gilui l'zulas yet, but he now wants something. There's a clear state of desire. That there's a desire. It's just like we have when we suddenly wake up one day when you're 25 or 30 years old and say, I want a home. Doesn't mean you're building a home yet. It doesn't mean you have details. You just, inside of you, you feel I want a home. That's the nekuda that he's talking about here. A nekuda that came after a tzimtzum, because before that, it was not even defined by even the words, I want a home, or I want, period. So now, this is why it's called a yud. I'll stop here before I continue to make sure everybody understands the point. So it's going into the so-called the dynamics, dissecting in a way God's process of how he goes from not wanting or pre-wanting to wanting. So we now have some taste of how it is, and we can use ourselves as an example because we also have these two states. And again, I'm not talking about superficial desire. I'm talking about something that's embedded in a person. You know, like let's say a person is born with a musical talent. It could take years until you're aware of it, and years until you desire to play music. But that doesn't mean it wasn't there. It just means it was in a state of part of your etzem, completely not even revealed to yourself. Then it comes into a state which after, like a tzimtzum, a yud, and a nekuda of Rotzon, that's preceded by a state that it wasn't there in any revealed way. So that's step number one. That's the yud, before the tzimtzum, the yud Shem Havaya Shebe Rotzon. that he began this paragraph with. Any questions on this? Now he's going to go to step 2. What happens next? And I want to again refer you back in volume 2 when we spoke about, if you remember, the ayin of the Yesh Amiti. So the Rebbe Rashab went through several levels, what that ayin is. Then we learned it in Tzadik Daled from the Frierdiker Rebbe. Frierdiker Rebbe dissected it, if I recall, at least into 4 levels. So you saw there clearly that you have all these levels. Now, if I recall correctly, he may have even mentioned the Havaya Shebe Rotzon Lifnei Tzimtzum, but maybe not. But there for sure, there were the 3, if you remember, he spoke about that first there is the consideration. Like first he considers whether he should want this. The second is the deliberation, where he deliberates the shakavitaria about it. So there's haskama, then there's the shakavitaria, then there's the hachlota, where he finally determines, yes, I'm going to build existence. And all these are levels before the tzimtzum. And we learned about it at length then, but it's very much, I see parallels to what we're saying here, but here's obviously more brief. But okay, then comes like this. Then comes step 2. Now that he's revealed within himself, I want this, whatever it is I want. In this case, of course, it's going to be existence. So then this revelation to himself, which is just a nakuda at this point, it's a desire. This now comes into a state of expansion. So now it's a gili that's starting to expand and has a relationship with the world. Because it's beginning to, it's not just the artist saying, I want to create art, which can still be infinite possibilities of art. But now it's a gili shaykh le'elmas because he's expanding that will and saying, okay, what is it that I want? So this is already a gili shaykh le'elmas, not just gili la'atzmei. So it's an expansion, like a hey. From the yud has become a hey. For who? And what does this consist of? What arose in his seamless desire. It's a seamless desire initially. Lahaitzil, to emanate the world of Atzilus, Ulivrei, and to create the world of Bria. And then, of course, comes Yitzira Asi. In other words, he is now, it's expanded into an actual desire of what exactly he wants. And what does he do next? V'shir ba'asmei b'kayach. I've referred to that term a number of times because that's the expression of Goliv Galifu b'tehirei law. That now he shir ba'asmei b'kayach. We translate, the closest translation we had was he allocates. You know, shir could also mean he estimates, but we're not talking about estimation because God is not estimating. But it's like a carpenter or an architect, I should say, that estimates what kind of resources he will need to build his home. Shir ba'asmei b'kayach is an expression from the Migdash Melech, which is a commentary on the Zohar. Chassidus brings it very often, especially in Ayin Beis, that now the artist has envisioned and allocated ba'atzmei b'koyach, and the potential is still in his potential state, but it's no longer just a general nekuda of desire. It's been expanded, expastus, into the shaychel elements and shir ba'atzmei b'koyach. The zeu b'chinas he'er shena. And this is the second letter, the second stage in the Yud Kei Vav Kei in the Rotzon, which is called the first Hey, in contrast to the last Hey, Yud Kei Vav Kei. Here he's not going to discuss, I believe, the Vav Kei. He's only talking about the first 2, the Yud Kei, which interesting parallels what we learned before with the Shalheves Yud Kei. So maybe this is all going to come together now. So this is as all this is written about elsewhere at length. Now I remember it relatively, I don't say length, but definitely in volume 2 and somewhat in volume 1 in the beginning. But I believe in Tafresh Nun Beis, I have to look it up. There are some Maimonim from the Rebbe Rashab where he discusses this in much more detail in earlier years. But he says, he's only quoting what's necessary to understand what we're learning here. Okay. Any questions on this second stage now, before I continue? I want to go very deliberate, slowly, make sure everything's clear. And now he's going to bring it back to the process, what happens next. Remember, all this is lifnei tzimtzum. This is before the tzimtzum that we know of, the tzimtzum arishin, where God actually conceals all the energy. Right now, it's all within what he calls atzmusei, within the infinite energy, within the divine consciousness, pre-tzimtzum. Any clarity needed here? Okay, let's roll ahead. The kvan is bar le'il. So I'm line 4 on page 1333. And it was already explained earlier. The Nakudas Reshimu, that the point of the Reshimu, remember we called it a Nakuda, like a Yud. That the point of the Reshimu, it encompasses all the levels of Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. This was very clearly explained on page 1330. Both the Gilui Lezulas, going from the bottom up, the Hey, which is the revelation to the other, which means how God is envisioning existence. The Yud, the way he reveals to himself. And we learned that even the Etzem, or what he calls here, that's even higher than before it broke down into desire. Even that level is all encompassed in the Nakudas Reshimu. That was explained a few pages back. So based on all of the above, we can say that the level of Yud in the Havaya Sheberotzen, we're talking now the Havaya in the desire before the Tzimtzum. And this is the Yud is before it arose in his desire. Okay, 1 second here. This seems to be a little different than what he said earlier, but let me just read it again. This is preceding Alesa Rotzon.
It seems to be saying exactly what he said at the bottom of the prior page. He's just repeating himself.
No? That's not what he said on page 1330. That's what I'm referring to. We'll soon see. Let's just read what he says here. So he says, the B'chinas Yud D'Shei B'Shem Havaya, Shezeh B'chinas Keidem Alesa Rotzon. Hurak Agila L'Atzmei. So it's only the revelation to himself. So he's calling now the revelation to himself before it arose in his desire. And that's not what he said, I think, on the bottom of last page. He said, also to himself. Then came the Tzimtzum. Then there's required a Tzimtzum to come into Rotzon, but the Rotzon is only for himself. So I think even what he said before, by the Tzimtzum, Yud, the Rotzon is Gilui La'atzmei. Now he's saying the Rotzon Gilui La'atzmei is Kaidem Aloisa Rotzon. I have to say he means before it arose in his desire, the details, what's called Ispastus, that's what he means here. You have to say that's what he means. He doesn't mean Kaidem Aloisa Rotzon in general, because then there would be no Yud either. The whole Yud is the beginning of the desire, but it's only a Nakuda. Okay, V'ura Gilui La'atzmei commission is Bar Liel. This needs some explanation, but basically it could be that it's all relative. What do you mean by desire? You know, you could say that having a desire to have a home doesn't really mean a desire until you actually envision the details of that. That's what it sounds like to me. On page 1330, he said clearly that there's a level that's so either he's not referring to that here altogether. Because there he said Alesa Rotzon is Mamala, Kedem Alesa Rotzon is Seviv. One minute, 1 second. And you could also say that there's Chedem Alesa Rotzon. You could, it depends how you interpret the Yud. If the Yud is after God wants, is one thing. If the Yud is still how he's in a state before he wants, and the Yud is like, yeah. I'm a little confused, to be honest, because I would have thought that this is B'chinas Alesa Rotzon, but not the Aleis HaRotzon of the details. But that's probably what he means.
The Yud can't precede that initial inclination because that's the nature of the Yud. There's nothing but God.
That's why I'm wondering what he means here. Because now he's saying the Yud is Koydem Aleis HaRotzon and it's Gili La'atzmei. So I'm saying my answer is that Koydem Aleis HaRotzon, he may mean here the Aleis HaRotzon of the Ispashtus of the Hay. That's the only way that I can explain it. It's exactly my point. Okay, we'll get back to it. Let's read on. It may be clear once we read. It doesn't change the real pshat and avana. Just trying to determine what he calls what exactly. My understanding was Koydem Aleis HaRotzon means before there's a Yud altogether. Then there's a Yud which is Aleis HaRotzon, but just a Rotzon La'atzmei. And then there's the Hey, a Rotzon Le'zulas, L'shpashtus, and that's the Hey. Okay. To look at this and back on page 1330, where I'll go through it again until we figure it out. Zehu b'chinas. So now I said, "Im kein shem b'chinas Yud b'shem Havaya sheberotzon." That the Yud Hashem b'rash b'chinas Koydem Aleis HaRotzon v'Agil La'atzmei. Zehu b'chinas Yud hakol ba'avir. That's the Yeshlema. Since the Reshimu encompasses all the levels before the Tzimtzum, like he said, so the Yud of Shem Havaya sheberotzon that we're talking now, Gili La'atzmei, that's the Yud HaKol Ba'avir. That means that the Avir is Yud. Is the Yud HaKol Ba'avir. Okay. Now that makes sense totally. In other words, in the Reshimu we have, we said in general two things. The very core, the very essence of the letters of the Reshimu, which we're going to learn about afterwards soon. But we're talking about the Ohr within the Reshimu. The Avir is Yud. So now the Yud that we're talking about in the Reshimu is the Yud is basically encompassing the Yud of Koydem Aleis HaRotzon, what he calls Gili La'atzmei. The truth is, on page 1330, he said it even includes that which is higher than that. That which is even Etzem Ohr, that he called, the words he used there was, as I said before, L'mayla gam Koydem Aleis HaRotzon. But as far as the Yud we're talking now, we're talking about the Yud of the Reshimu. He's now placed that Yud is different than the Yud of the Kav and the Chachma. There, the Yud was a Yud of Gili. Here, this is a Yud of Helam. It's only Gili La'atzmei. That's the Yud of the Avir of the Reshimu.
Can I ask a quick question to try and reconcile those 2 points? It seems like on one page 1330, he's talking about the Ohr Ein Sof itself. That has to be called Aleis HaRotzon because that's all there was before. What rose in his desire is God Himself, and that he's saying that even that Ohr is in the Reshimu, and then you have the Yud, which is Aleis HaRotzon, the beginning stages of the creative process where God thinks unto Himself, "I want to do something." So he's saying they're both true.
You're not reconciling. You're just making the question stronger. That's exactly my question. They can be both true. Is the Yud Koydem Aleis HaRotzon or is it Aleis HaRotzon? Which one is it? Both?
I don't think he's saying the Yud on page 1330.
No, I'm talking about something right here. He says the Yud is Koydem Aleis HaRotzon. Trust me, it seems something inconsistent here. I tried to explain it, but we'll deal with it later. Okay. Let's not get over.
Okay.
Because here he says clearly it's Bechinas Koydem Aleis HaRotzon. I mean, I already suggested a reconciliation, but let's not. I'd rather wait to hear the whole picture before I comment on it. Just pointing out that when you read it, it seems like it's not clear when does the Rotzon begin exactly. Okay. Now, let's go back to the theme here. What's important here is this. So the Yud now, the Yud is the Yud of Havaya. Okay. The Kol Zeh, however, Even the way it's in the Reshimu, which is encompassing what is before the Tzimtzum, and it's only a Gilui La'atzmei, it's still, at the end of the day, it's not Cheshach. This is not Helam. This is a source of a source, at least, to Ohr V'Gilui. Sheyiyah Acharat Tzimtzum. It's a source for a source, at least, for the Ohr, the revelation and the light and the revelation that will be after the Tzimtzum. Shubchinas Gilui Ohr HaKav. Which is referring to the revelation of the Kav, the light of the Kav. That is extends, umeir and radiates in the general cosmic order, whole cosmic order. The Reishis Hagilu B'chinas Chochmah, like we learned before on page 1331, that the beginning, the head of the Kav, begins with the level of, the Reishis Hagilu, the beginning of the revelation, is Chochmah, Shazal B'chinas Yud Sheba B'Gilui Kanal. So Chochmah is the first revelation, is still concentrated and moved on, like he said, but it's still a Gilui, which is rooted in the head of the Kav, which now is rooted in the Yud of Avir and the Reshimu, which is rooted in the Kedem Ales HaRotzon, the Yud of Rotzon. The Yud and the Rotzon. Yud Sheb'Shem Havaya Sheb'Rotzon. But now he's going to go, that's all still, even though it's in the Reshimu, it's still in the category of how the Reshimu relates to Gilui. But there's another level in the Reshimu. We go back to page 1330. He said, yes, Beis Inyanim. Etzem Nekudas Reshimu, which is Kayach HaGvul Helam HaAtzmi. That's a different track. Al B'chinas Avir Be'etzem. That level of Avir Be'etzem, remember we said was Etzem Choshech. It was fundamentally darkness. It has Ohr Yud in it, but there's another part to it. Avir Be'etzem, fundamentally, Ubchinas Etzem Choshech V'Nelam Be'Helam Atzmi, is fundamental state of a darkened state and concealed in a fundamental concealment, built in Bizgala, that's not revealable. It's not even yet in a state that you can call it a source of a source for Chachma, which is called Ohr. We're talking about a completely different track, God's power to conceal. That has nothing to do with the power to reveal.
You were just reading from 1330?
I'm reading from 1333. We were up to.
No, what you just read was 1330 or 1333?
We were continuing 1333.
I'm sorry. Okay, I thought you were going back to 1330.
And this is the core point of the Reshimu, the first part of the Reshimu that we spoke about earlier. So everything we've been talking about till now has been the Yud, which is already beginning of Gilui. And even the Yud of Avir in Reshimu is still something connected to Gilui. Now we're talking about the very existence of letters, not the ideas that are concealed in the letters or the potential. This comes from the Etzem Ohr. That's higher than even a Gilui La'atzmei, like he said on page 1330. Now, this is not a contradiction, because now he's going to say right away, I'll explain how we understand both these dimensions. But now he's talking about something that's higher than Gilui La'atzmei even. So it's even higher than a Yud, because it's higher from even being revealed to himself. And higher than that, Helam Atzmi Mamish, which is even higher than Etzem Ohr. Helam Atzmi Mamish means the core concealed element, the power of God, as was explained earlier. Yeah. I'm just looking back for a moment. I want to see.
He's saying to add somehow or? Is that how?
One minute. Okay. Let me just read another few lines and I'll explain, and then I'll be happy to take questions. This is called the level of the core name of Hashem. Shezeu Shem Havaya below Osi is the Yud. This is the Shem Havaya that doesn't have any letters of Yud. So the Shem Havaya that consists of Yud Vav. Now we've reached a level that's higher, Shmoya Atzmi, that doesn't have letters altogether. Not even the Yud, not even the Gili La'atzmi. So now we're talking about a level that's either, like he says, Etzem Ha'or, and even higher, Helam Ha'atzmi. V'amshachem eb'chinas madrega zu. Ein eb'chinas Gili Erkim b'chinas Helam. And the transmission from this level is not in a state of revelation, it's in a state of concealment. U'kamay matan b'seiser. The idea of like when you give a matana in anonymously. So it means it's basically referring to a level that's higher than revelation. And now this is the ultimate conclusion. Valkain, this is going to be the third level of transformation. And then I'll go back and explain. And therefore, when from this level is nimshach hakoyach lafichas acheshach, from this level is nimshach the power, transmits the power to transform darkness. This is not that it's coming to radiate the darkness like the higher level of Ohr that we talked about, the second level of sweetening. Like the light that replaces and comes in place of the darkness. Here we're getting a power that comes to completely to extinguish the darkness altogether. And basically the third level that he spoke about before, where the bitterness itself, the darkness itself from within is being transformed, not through any Gili Ohr. That's this power of the Reshimu itself, and contrast to the light, the Avir or the Yud within the Reshimu. So the Reshimu has both elements to it, the power to illuminate and transform the darkness from without through Ohr, and the power to transform it from within, which is through darkness itself, the Helam Ha'atzmi. So now let me explain what we just learned. And this is part of what I was, in my introduction to this whole piece, I already anticipated this challenge, this question. So let me just go over a few things I've said and just explain this a little deeper. Because right here comes another issue. He says that the Etzem Ha'or, that's higher than Gilui altogether, he says that's the Nekudas Etzem Nekudas Reshimu. He says Helam Mamish Etzem Ha'or Shalamayla Gam B'chinas Gilui La'atzmi. But then he says Ulamayla Mezeh B'chinas Helam Ha'atzmi Mamish. Which one is it? If you're saying it's Etzem Ha'or, as much as it's not Ohr revealed, it's still called Etzem Ha'or. It's still the archetype of Ohr. It's not the archetype of Helam. And so when you say it's Helam Ha'atzmi and you say it's Etzem Ha'or, these are not seemingly not the same level. So what does he mean there? Here to say that it's Helam Mamish and it's both coming from Etzem Ha'or and it's coming from Helam, even higher than that, Helam Ha'atzmi. So I want to refer you back where similar language was used when he started first introducing the Reshimu. I'm going back to page 1271. So look there. Then I'll explain what he's saying. So on page 1269 or 1270, let me see. Yeah, 1270, sorry. So on page 1269 is where the Rebbe Rashab began to explain that the Reshimu has these two elements. He says clearly, Yesh Beis Inyonim, Etzem Nekudas Reshimu, exactly what he said. Excuse me, 1 second. Exactly what he said here on page 1330. He said back in 1269. And then he went through a whole piece. The truth is, I'd read it again with you guys because it's so relevant here. But for now, let me sum it up. So he said like this. So there's the koyach hagvul, that's the power for God to confine, like we discussed a number of times. The very creation of letters is not just the absence of light. Because then you could say, you know what, God created light, and then he diminished the light. But we've learned that the very fact that God created containers, and ultimately a body, the body is not created by light. Our body is not a creation of our souls. The soul comes from the power of Gilui. The body comes from the power of Gvul, or Tzimtzum and Helam. Then they come together. It's true, they work with each other. And the body's energy is revealed through the soul's energy. Like you see a fetus. You can have a soul, but if you don't have a container, even one cell, and if the seed of the father does not fertilize the egg of the mother, you can have all the souls in the world. It's not going to come into a physical child. So you need the neshama, you need the nekuda, which is essentially the nekuda of the Reshimu, so to speak, the root of the containers, which is the root from Helam Ha'atzmi. Then you have a neshama where God says, I'm going to send a soul, and that soul, as it enters the body, it will help the body grow. That's why a fetus grows soul and body together. Well, upon death, Rahman al-Islam, the opposite happens. The soul leaves the body, but the body still remains because it's not rooted in the soul. If the body was a creation of the souls and the soul leaves, so it's like, then the body should disappear. The fact is the body has its own source, its own root. And yet we see the body decomposes. Why? Because ultimately God wanted that the Helam, Ha'atzmi, that is the root of the Kalim, of the Guf, should travel through the Kav and the Gili of the Neshama, because that's what gives it life. And that also is why it ultimately decomposes. So the decomposition shows you both things, that it's rooted in another place, but also that energy flows through the Kav. In other words, the Reshimu, with all its power from Helam Ha'atzmi, needs the Kav to reveal its potency. On the other hand, the Kav on its own can't create Kalim without a Reshimu, without the Koyach HaHelam. So it's a very eloquent mix of these two. But what do you see from this? That the very containers of existence are created by the Koyach HaGvul, the Reshimu, which is rooted in the Koyach HaGvul before the Tzimtzum, which is rooted in the Helam Ha'atzmi. And yet there's another track called Ohr, where God reveals. And there's Etzem Ohr, there's Ohr that he reveals to himself, there's the Ohr that he reveals to another, which is also encompassed in the Reshimu. That's the Yud and the Avir of the Reshimu. So the Reshimu has both elements. That's essentially what he said here, and even more elaborately on 1269. But then here comes the next language here. So 1 second here. So we understand the Reshimu has elements of Ohr within it, because like the letters, even letters have the capacity, the letters potentially, the ideas are in there. Beis, Reish, Vav, Chaf, like I gave the example, even though until you don't combine those letters together, they're just 4 random letters. But when you do, Beis, Reish, Vav, Chaf lend themselves and are conducive and have the potential when you combine them, which is what the Kav does. It combines them and you have the word bracha, baruch, blessed. So you can't say they're mutually exclusive, these two tracks, because at the end of the day, they both come from God. But God wanted it to make sense, so he created these two tracks of Helam and Gili, the Ohr and Tzimtzum, if you wish. But now the question is, fine. So the Reshimu we know has both elements in it. There's the Etzem Nekudas of Reshimu that's rooted in the Koyach HaGvul, and what we would call the Helam Ha'atzmi. But why then is he saying it's rooted in Etzem Ohr? So if you look at the bottom of 1269, here's what he says. The Nimtza, I'm reading 5 lines from the bottom. Or I'll go even earlier. The light, the tzimtzum did not impact the Ohr that's encompassed in the Shima, the Imlekein ends a Reshim, because then it wouldn't be called a Reshim. That's what the Reb Marash explains, like he quotes there from the Torah Ohr, and they suffers, that's the Reb Marash's Hagah and Matzazu Tofreshman. Okay. V'nimtza, 5 lines from the bottom of 1269. And v'nimtza, we derive from this, that the light within the Reshimu, which is concealed, but it's light in the Reshimu, what now we're calling the Yud of Avir, he says the Ohr Yud, yeah, is Mahusa it's coming from Primis Rotzon, before it arose in his desire. And the way it's in the etzem, but it's all in a concealed state in the Reshimu. This is all the Ohr within the Reshimu. The very core of the Reshimu, like what he said here, that the very Nekudas Reshimu comes from Etzem Ohr, which is higher from even Primis Ohr that we discussed here, which is at least a Gili La'atzmei. That's what he said on top of the page. Okay. V'hu b'chinas hu. Shelamaylam b'chinas shmoi. That's the level of hu that's higher than shmoi. And then he continues on page 1270 and says, this is the Eisi Sharshim b'chinas Yechidish Nefesh. But I want to just I'm skipping some lines. Then he says, the etzem harishim b'chinas helam ha'er shalamayim b'chinas helam v'gamri, v'gam yeshlem b'deshashim b'chinas helam ha'atzmi dein sof, dainu b'chinas shmoi hakol b'atzmus she'ena b'chinas er klal kim b'chinas yecheles. Okay, so this is going to help clarify what we learned here. Basically, what he's saying, which is it definitely makes things more complex. So the Reshimu has in it 2 things. The Ohr that's encompassed in it, that goes all the way up to the Yud that he said, which he called Primis Ohr before, and here he calls it the Yud Shem Havaya, Gili La'atzmei. And then there's the Etzem Nekudas Reshimu, which that he's relating that to both Etzem Ohr and even higher Helam Ha'atzmi. So my fundamental question is, why don't you just say that the Ohr within the Reshimu includes Etzem Ohr, like he said on page 1330. He said it clearly. So my answer would be the following. One second. Because he wants to perhaps say, as I pointed out a few times, that there is a place where Ohr and Helam do overlap. And that's in God's power. When you say God has the power, the capacity, Yecholte, to reveal, and he also has the capacity to conceal, at the end of the day, you can't divide God into 2. It's one power that he has 2 powers. There's one Atzmus, Etzem, that has 2 powers. So I think what he is hinting to is that even the power of Helam, the power of the Etzem Nekudas Reshimu, is not just traceable to Helam Ha'atzmi, it's also traceable to Etzem Ohr. So how do you reconcile the 2? Because Etzem Ohr is not a Gili B'Poel, not even to himself. In other words, Etzem Ohr has on one hand, is going to be ultimately the archetype, as I mentioned, the power to reveal, which will manifest ultimately, like he said, in the Mokir L'Mokir, which is the Yud, the Gili La'atzmai, then the Gili L'Zulose. But in its root, since it's coming from the same Atzmos, maybe the Etzem Ohr has something similar to the Helam Ha'atzmi, because both of them are Atzmi's powers, God's power to reveal and God's power to conceal. So maybe that's why he's saying that the Etzem Nekudas Reshimu, first he says is Helam Mamish, Etzem Ohr, because even in Ohr there's a level of Helam Mamish, but it's really not at the end of the day fundamental concealment, because it is called Ohr, Etzem Ohr. And Lamaylam is there's even a higher power in the Reshimu called Helama Atzmi. Now, this is not explicit in Ayin Beis. It's just me trying to explain how you could say both at once, that it's Etzem Ohr and also Helama Atzmi. And he makes it clear it's Lamaylam is that. That means it's not the same level. It's a higher level within it. But what it ultimately does is that the Reshimu will have somewhere in its DNA both Gili and Helam Atzmi, and even the highest level of Gili, which touches and connects to Helam, and ultimately, therefore, that when we reveal the divine in existence, we have all the qualities. Existence itself is coming from the Helam Atzmi, and the Helam Atzmi within the Reshimu. The revelation is coming through the Ohr, and the Ohr, Etzem Ohr, has something in common with the Helam Atzmi and something in common with the Giluyim of Ohr La'atzmei L'Zulose. So you really, at the end of the day, have that unity as well at work, while also maintaining the boundaries between Gilui and Helam. That's how I would understand it. And ultimately, L'Asadlovi, they will all join together as being all forces coming from the divine, where body and soul become so powerful that the body itself will sustain the neshama, like we learned earlier, because the Helam Atzmi of the Reshimu will have the power to reveal the Elokus as it comes from Helam Atzmi, and that will in turn to sustain the soul. So just like today, the soul, even though this body has a different root than the soul, but the soul still, the energy of the kalim of the body travels through the soul, like I said before, both in development of the fetus and also in the decomposition later. So the Asala will be the other way around, that the Helam of the Reshimu, the Helam Atzmi, that is the power of the body, will also be able to sustain the soul, which comes from Giluyim. Why? Because the Reshimu, and therefore ultimately the body, also has a connection to Etzem Ohr, which ultimately has something in common with the Ohr that will become the Ohr of the soul and the Neshama. So initially they're different tracks, but they also have elements that interconnect with each other and ultimately even unite with each other. That's how I would explain this piece. Now, I hope that was clear, even though it's a little dense and subtle, but that's how I would understand combining this to the pages before 1270 and what he's saying here in 1333. And bottom line is that the second level, the Ohr level, it transforms the darkness from without, and the Helam Atzmi, or the Etzem Ohr and Helam Atzmi, transforms the darkness from within, like he said here. There's more
that was a really brilliant reconciliation. That really worked.
Well,
that really worked. You have in the Reshimu all the stuff, all the cosmic stuff you need for creation. You have light and darkness within, and you have the differentiation between the two. Yet it's encompassed within the same. A little bit of a paradox, but that's what's necessary for the creation process.
And the beauty is, because it's in the Reshimu, it doesn't disturb our ability, the student, to develop. Because if the Reshimu was revealed, we'd be back to square one. Then that's Lifnei Tzimtzum. In other words, the Reshimu is Lifnei Tzimtzum, but in a concentrated capsule, waiting to be released as we grow through the Kav and develop Mutfa, Murgish, Muskel through all the levels of growth and maturity. That's
beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've used a number of examples, but like the apple seed was a good one, or any seed is a really good one. Of course, it doesn't help you with light and darkness, but it contains within it all the DNA that for anything that creation is going to become. Still, it's not quite the same. I have a question though, that's implied by all of this. It seems like in order to put all that together, to take the constituent elements of that whole logical analysis you just did, which is coming from the Rebbe Rashab, it almost seems like darkness precedes light. Now we know that in the creation story, darkness precedes light, but it's kind of hard to understand. It almost seems like light emerges from darkness. The Etzem HaOr is below the Helam HaAtzmi. Therefore, it seems like the Or is somehow derived from darkness. Is that not a fair statement, or they're just two separate tracks? I'm a little confused. And if God is Or is Elokus, and I know God can't be limited, but it almost seems like in some weird paradoxical way, light derives from darkness.
Well, it's what you're saying is half right and half incorrect. The part that's right is Bereisha Chashecha v'Hada Nehura is the expression. That first there was dark and then there was light, like you said, the Eretz v'Cheshach al Pnei Tahim, and then you hear Ohr. So that's correct in what you're saying. That Tzimtzum precedes the Kav, Cheshach precedes. As far as in the highest levels, the Helam Ha'atzmi could be higher than the Etzem Ohr, but that doesn't mean the Etzem Ohr comes from Helam Ha'atzmi. You could have two tracks, and each one is an expression of God's power, the power to reveal, the power to conceal. Now, why is that higher then? Not because it's the source of the power to reveal, is because Helam reflects and gives us a taste of God that's not defined. Gili gives us a taste of God as he comes into definition. Because the very word Gili means expression, consciousness, even if it's a Gili that's not yet Gili La'atzmei, meaning it's not even he's conscious, but the very fact that you have the concept of Etz Ohr, you mean you already have somewhere the concept of revelation. So in that sense, it doesn't capture the so-called non-defined God that's beyond any form of tzir and expression and definition. On the other hand, Ohr reveals to us, reveals. Without Ohr, if you only had Helam Ha'atzmi, you would not ever have revelation. It would be like, okay, embedded in existence, you have a Helam Ha'atzmi, but you and I can never access it. So if you go back to page, I mentioned this page a number of times. It's a very fundamental page where he explains the difference between the Kav and the Reshimu, or in this case, so he says, if you look at it, it's on page, here we are, page 7. Oh, I mentioned now the same page we just read, 1270, the second paragraph. So there he says, why Kalim are rooted higher than Ohr. So he says that the Mitzias Eir min Asmus zel dover amusik b'sichlenu. We can understand that Atzmus is reveals himself. It makes sense. But he says, even though God is be'emes musal mi'in ha'er, and Ohr is already a Mitzias, but nevertheless, once it exists, it makes sense. Just like the sun gives off light, God gives off light. Not that he's defined by it, but he gives it off. When you see a keli, when you see concealment, that tells us that God is not defined by the regular revelation. It's like what I pointed out, when a wise person is quiet, it reveals more about him. His restraint reveals more about him than his revelation. His revelation makes sense. A smart person has what to say, but does he know how to not say something? That shows you that his wisdom is so profound that it's higher than revelation. That's what he says there, basically. I would suggest reading it a few times because also, when we learned Tzaddik Daled, he also spoke about what does the Yesh reveal to us about Atzmus, and what does the Ohr reveal to us. I don't know the word reveal is the right, what the Yesh teaches us about Atzmus, and what the Ohr teaches us. That's a lot of what we're talking about. So therefore, I would say to you is that Ohr and Cheshach are two different tracks. In the actual process, Cheshach precedes Ohr, but it doesn't mean that Ohr necessarily comes from Cheshach.
Got it. This is absolutely fascinating. It's mind-blowing. One implication, and not only go off the reservation here, but it has a major implication in very simple practical terms as we sit here today, like learning. And the idea of Helam, the void, the darkness, the concealment of godliness in the lowest levels. We can't see God per se, right? But at the same time, I mean, I'm trying to have this insight that the Helam, the absence of God that we see, we experience, if you will, is a sense also part of God. Unless you're saying it's a different Helam, I don't know how you can say there's a concealment and there's one kind of godly concealment and there's one kind of concealment that's not godly. I don't think you can say that. So in a sense, when you say I can't see God here and like sitting here learning Ayin Beis and being with my family, eating my food, I can't see God. I it's like kafel mechupel. These talk about that. In a sense, that kafel mechupel is God too. That Helam is essentially godliness as well. Everything's God.
That is correct.
Yeah.
That is
So that's
correct.
pretty mind-blowing. So when you're feeling very, very alone and you're feeling really dark and you're feeling like, I don't get any of this, you're actually steeped in godliness even there. You don't understand why. It feels weird, but you're steeped in godliness, mamash, right there.
That is correct, but still God wants us to also benefit from seeing it, not just to remain that way. So that's correct.
Yeah. But
That's
it's
why
reassuring. It's very
that's
comforting.
why we want
Yeah.
Geula. Geula is not just for us, but it's also for God, because if it's not revealed, it shows it's not complete either. This is one of the chidushim of the Rebbe. In a Sikha in Chelik Hey Vayigash, the Rebbe explains, and Kates Mem Zayin, he explains that he asked the question, if that's the case, that the Helam reaches Etzem, so why do we need the Geula? Is the Geula just a candy for us immature or limited human beings? No, from Mashiach, from God's point of view, Helam is just as much God as Gili. So why do we need Gili of Geula? And the Rebbe answers, when we say Yofa Sha'achas B'tshuva Maisim Tevim, the 1 hour of tshuva and good deeds in this world is worth more. The Kol Chai Elam Haba, is that only for us? And he answers a brilliant answer, that for the Etzem to remain concealed is also a limitation. So even though concealment does reveal a dimension of God that's even deeper than revelation, but the fact that that remains that way is also a limitation. So God wants the concealed to be revealed. As we're going to be learning, this is the whole third dimension of sweetening.
It's really beautiful.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Really getting to the core of existence, the very core of it.
Yeah, and it's not over yet. So you're going to see, I'm going to stop here. But the next half of this paragraph, he's going to start tying it together. There's a lot here to process. And I did add, I have to say, some of the things I said, I cannot say with 100% certainty that that's mamish the pshat here. It's my understanding of it. I just wanted to make that clear. But I stand behind it. But it doesn't explain. I still need to figure out a little this Kedem Alesa Rotzon thing. It probably is connected to what I just said as well, that in other words, even in Ohr, there's a state of Helam in Ohr, and then there's a state of Gili in Ohr. Just like we talk about the Kav and the Avir of the Reshimu. So there's a lot to unpack. I want to think it through a little more as well.
Yeah,
but you see how the Reshimu becomes such a. Now you can understand, the classes I gave in Reshimu are so much based on this development. Because when you first read about Reshimu in the earlier texts from the Rabbeim all the way from the Alter Rebbe and before that, all this is not clear. It's very limited. And now you see the Rebbe Rashab turns it into a major Yesod foundation here.
It's beautiful. It's unbelievable.
So I'm going to stop here, middle of page 1333. Does anybody else want to ask anything?